Jake and Sophie sat together on the couch, the dim light of the television flickering across their faces. The evening was peaceful, the kind of night where nothing felt out of the ordinary. Their world was quiet and safe, but that tranquility was about to be shattered. Jake laughed as Sophie teased him about how he always fell asleep during movies. She nudged him playfully, and they shared a moment of warmth. He didn't realize how lucky he was to have her in his life. Everything felt perfect. As the credits began to roll, the sudden flash of light outside the window caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just a passing car's headlights, but the light grew brighter and brighter, and before he could react, the ground trembled beneath them. A low hum filled the air. Something wasn't right. Sophie's eyes widened in confusion and concern. What was happening? Jake stood up, instinctively reaching for the door, but before he could make it, the air around them seemed to warp with a sharp crack. A figure appeared in front of them, towering and strange, its silhouette a shadow of something that didn't belong. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural hue. Sophie gasped. She tried to step back, but the figure moved faster than Jake could process. Before either of them could react, it was upon them. The being raised a device in its hand, and in an instant Jake felt a force tugging at him, a sharp sting in his chest, and everything went dark. He collapsed to the floor, his body refusing to respond, his mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. Sophie screamed, but her voice faded as if being pulled away from him. The world spun and then went still. When Jake's vision cleared, the figure was gone. But Sophie was not standing where she had been. Her voice was gone, too. All he could hear was the faint hum of something far off, as if it was calling to him, pulling him toward the unknown. His heart pounded with the realization that something had taken her, something not human, something alien. Jake struggled to move his limbs, but they felt heavy, like they were made of stone. His breath came in shallow bursts as the world around him spun in and out of focus. But then something inside of him clicked with a surge of adrenaline. He pushed himself up to his knees, his mind racing. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't lose her, not like this, not to some alien freak that thought he could just walk in and take what was his. He gritted his teeth, fighting through the fog in his brain. He found his feet and stumbled to the nearby table, grabbing a small device, his hand shaking slightly, but his grip steady. With a single thought, he activated it. A soft beep filled the air, and a flickering map appeared on the screen. This was it, the alien ship, the one that had taken Sophie. He had no time to waste. He knew what he had to do. He would find her. He would get her back, whatever it took, and no alien was going to stop him. Jake's eyes narrowed as the adrenaline kicked in. There was no turning back now. He was going to show them what humans were capable of. Jake's heart raced as the device in his hand hummed with a steady pulse. He could feel the weight of what he had to do settle heavily in his chest. Sophie was out there somewhere, and every second counted. The map on his screen showed a faint trail of energy left behind by the alien ship, a signature that would lead him straight to it. He wasted no time, slipping out the door and into the night. The sky was clear, but the air felt charged, as if something else was waiting just beyond the horizon. His mind was a blur of focus and rage. He kept telling himself it was just an alien. This wasn't a monster movie. This was real life, and he was going to stop it. Jake took a deep breath and pushed the fear aside, his training kicking in. He'd been in situations far worse than this and made it out alive. He wasn't about to let some extraterrestrial thief take Sophie from him. He didn't care how advanced their technology was or how far they came from. Jake was going to make them regret ever stepping foot on Earth. The streets were eerily quiet as he moved through the neighborhood, blending into the shadows. The device in his hand beeped at regular intervals, guiding him forward. He had no idea how far the alien ship was or how long the trail would last, but he wasn't going to stop until he found it. Jake knew every inch of this area, having grown up here. He used that knowledge to his advantage, sticking to alleyways and back roads where he wouldn't be seen. He couldn't afford to make any noise, not when he was about to face something far more dangerous than anything he had ever dealt with. Before the device's signal grew stronger and more defined, the closer he got to his destination, it led him to an abandoned industrial district, a place filled with old warehouses and rusting equipment. Nothing ever happened here anymore, and no one cared about the place anymore, which made it the perfect spot for an alien ship to hide. Jake crouched low and moved quickly across the cracked pavement, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. As he approached the largest building in the area, his heart was thudding in his chest, but his mind was laser-focused. The device showed the signal was coming from the rooftop. His pulse quickened. It had to be there. Whatever ship had taken Sophie was somewhere above him. He couldn't waste any more time. Using the building's old fire escape, Jake climbed to the top, his muscles aching from the exertion, but he pushed through the pain every step closer to Sophie. The better, the night air was cold against his skin, but the fire inside him kept him warm. As he reached the rooftop, he spotted the faint shimmer of a cloaked ship hovering just above the building, a low hum vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. This was it. Jake crouched behind a nearby water tower, out of sight from any surveillance, and studied the ship in front of him. The craft was sleek and smooth, its surface glimmering in the dim light of the street lamps below it was far beyond anything humans had ever created, but to Jake it was just another obstacle to overcome. He needed a plan. The alien ship wasn't just going to let him waltz aboard without a fight. Jake's mind raced through possible scenarios. He couldn't just barge in, guns blazing. The ship's defenses would tear him apart in seconds. No, he needed to think smart. He needed to find a way in without being detected. His gaze flickered around the rooftop, looking for something, anything that could help him sneak aboard the ship. When his eyes landed on a nearby vent system, an idea sparked in his mind. He could use that to infiltrate the ship undetected. With a determined nod, Jake began to move toward the vent, his mind already calculating the risks, the dangers. But there was no going back now. Sophie was out there waiting, and he was the only one who could get her back. Jake slid into the vent system, his heart hammering with adrenaline. The cold metal walls scraped against his palms as he moved quickly, every noise sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the ship. The faint hum of alien machinery reverberated through the walls, the sound a constant reminder of how far from home he truly was. He had no idea what awaited him inside, but he couldn't afford to waste time. Sophie was out there, and every second counted. The vent led him deeper into the ship's core, far from the main entryway. Jake had no idea how the ship was structured, but the device in his hand gave him a rough map, guiding him toward the heart of the craft. The air inside was sterile, thick with the scent of unfamiliar metals and something else, something faintly alive, like the ship itself had a pulse. He didn't dwell on it. He focused on the mission. His fingers tightened around the edges of the vent as he crawled forward. His military training had taught him the value of patience, the importance of moving quietly, observing before acting. But this wasn't just about strategy. This was about saving Sophie. His body was on high alert, every muscle tense as he approached what he hoped was the main area. He could feel the pulse of energy running through the walls, the faint vibration from the ship's core. He reached a small grate and paused. Voices. Low, guttural, alien, though the tone was unmistakable. Zorgoth, the creature that had taken Sophie, was speaking to his crew. Jake's gut clenched with rage as he heard Zorgoth's voice, arrogant and calm. Jake could barely make out the words, but it didn't matter. He'd be ready for whatever came next. Jake crawled silently toward a hatch in the vent that led directly into the ship's hallway. He'd have to move quickly. Once inside, he wouldn't have long before the Drexians would realize someone had infiltrated their ship. Jake twisted the vent's grate and eased it open, listening for any sign of movement on the other side. The coast was clear. He slipped out of the vent, crouching low, blending into the shadows. His eyes darted around the hallway, taking in the sleek metallic walls, the soft hum of the engines in the background, the occasional flicker of lights overhead. The ship was an engineering marvel, far more advanced than anything Jake had ever seen. But none of it mattered. Not now. His only focus was Sophie. Jake moved with purpose, staying to the walls as he crept toward the central control room. From his map, it seemed like the main area was just ahead. The voices of Zorgoth and his crew grew louder, the murmur of alien speech echoing in his ears. Jake didn't have a clear plan yet, but he knew he had to get closer. He needed information. He pressed his back to the wall, his breath steady despite the pounding in his chest. He could feel the heat of the ship's energy pulsing through the air, the low buzz of their power systems. A flicker of motion caught his eye. A pair of Drexian guards rounded the corner, heading his way. Jake froze, heart stopping. They were close, too close. He held his breath, waiting for them to pass, praying they wouldn't notice the slight rustling of his position. As they drew nearer, Jake's mind raced, calculating his options. There was no time to fight them. He had to move. Slowly, he reached for the small handheld weapon he'd brought, just in case. The guards' footsteps echoed louder, then softened as they turned the corner ahead. Jake let out the breath he'd been holding. He sprinted forward, making it to a nearby door just as the guards disappeared from view. He quickly pressed his ear to the door, listening. The voices inside were closer now. Jake steeled himself. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Taking a deep breath, he swung the door open, slipping inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with strange devices, and at its center stood Sophie, tied to a chair, but very much alive. Her eyes widened in recognition as she saw Jake, a mix of relief and disbelief flashing across her face. But it was the figure beside her, looming in the shadows, that made Jake's blood run cold. Zorgoth. He'd found her. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped deeper into the dim room, the door sliding shut behind him with a soft hiss. His eyes immediately locked on Sophie. She was alive, but bound to a chair, her face streaked with grime and sweat, but there was no mistaking the relief in her eyes when they met his. But Jake didn't dare take a step closer, not yet. His focus shifted to Zorgoth, standing calmly at the far side of the room, his glowing eyes narrowing as he assessed Jake with disdain. Zorgoth's voice was a low growl, alien yet surprisingly intelligible. "You are bold, human, but this is where your journey ends." Jake's muscles tensed. The alien was tall, easily over 7 feet, with a menacing presence that seemed to absorb the light around him. His body was armored in a sleek metallic suit, and his face, though humanoid in shape, was a grotesque amalgamation of sharp angles and glowing eyes. The alien's arrogance was palpable as he examined Jake, dismissing him as an insignificant threat. "I've seen what your kind is capable of," Zorgoth continued, his voice dripping with scorn. "But no matter how hard you fight, no matter how clever you think you are nothing before the might of the Drexian Empire." Jake stood motionless, the weight of his weapon heavy in his hands. The room seemed to close in on him, the tension thick. Zorgoth's arrogance made Jake sick, but it was also the fuel he needed. This alien had underestimated him from the start, and that was going to be his downfall. "You took her," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with quiet fury, "and I'm not leaving without her." Zorgoth's laugh echoed through the room, cold and mocking. "Do you think your petty weapons and tactics can stop me? I've killed creatures far stronger than you. You are just a fleeting moment in the history of the universe, a speck of dust in a sea of stars." Jake's fingers tightened around his gun, but he didn't act just yet. He needed to stay calm. He knew how dangerous Zorgoth was, how powerful. But he also knew one thing. This alien had no idea what a human could do when pushed to the limit. Suddenly, Zorgoth's hand shot out, sending a wave of energy toward Jake. It was too fast. Jake barely had time to react, diving to the side as the blast singed the floor where he'd just been standing. The force of it sent a shockwave through his body, but he pushed the pain aside, rolling to his feet and scrambling for cover behind a large control panel. Zorgoth didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, moving with an unnatural speed that left Jake no time to prepare. But Jake's instincts kicked in. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding another strike of deadly energy. The ship shook with the force of the blast, sparks flying from damaged systems. Jake knew he couldn't keep dodging forever. Zorgoth was relentless, and the alien's power was overwhelming. But Jake wasn't just going to outlast him. He had to outsmart him. With a grunt, Jake rolled behind a stack of crates, his mind working at lightning speed. He was fighting more than just Zorgoth. He was fighting everything this alien represented. The idea that humanity was weak, that they were easy prey. Jake wasn't going to let that stand. He glanced over at Sophie. Her eyes were locked on him, silently pleading for him to act. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the spark of hope. That spark was enough to give him the strength he needed. Jake had no choice now. He had to strike back, and he had to do it quickly before Zorgoth could unleash another brutal attack. Jake's eyes scanned the room, noting every detail, every possible advantage. He spotted a terminal on the far wall, its power core glowing faintly. If he could overload it, he could disrupt the ship's systems and give himself an opening. He just needed a few seconds. Zorgoth raised his hand, preparing for another deadly blast. But Jake was already moving, sprinting across the room with an agility born of desperation. In a split second, Jake dove toward the terminal, his hand reaching for the exposed wires. He ripped them free with a forceful tug, sending sparks flying. The room shook again, but this time it wasn't Zorgoth's attack. The ship's systems were faltering, destabilizing. Jake's gamble had worked. For just a moment, Zorgoth hesitated. The alien's eyes widened in shock as his control over the ship slipped. That was all Jake needed. With a roar, he lunged forward, using his momentum to tackle Zorgoth to the ground. The two tumbled across the floor, a blur of movement and raw energy. But Jake was focused. He had one chance to finish this. He drove the barrel of his gun into Zorgoth's chest, and this time, the alien didn't laugh. The air in the room crackled with tension, the flickering lights casting erratic shadows across the space. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he kept the barrel of his gun pressed firmly against Zorgoth's chest. The alien's arrogance had faltered, but Jake knew this moment wouldn't last long. Zorgoth's strength was far beyond his own, and he wouldn't stay down for long. The alien's breathing was shallow, his glowing eyes burning with fury as he struggled against the weight of Jake's body, pinning him to the floor. "You think you've won?" Zorgoth snarled through clenched teeth, his voice dripping with venom. "This ship is mine, human. You are nothing. The Drexian Empire will destroy your kind, and no matter how brave you think you are, you will never stop us." Jake gritted his teeth. The alien's threats were empty. It was clear to him now. The Drexians had underestimated humanity. They believed their technology and power were enough to crush anything in their way, but they had overlooked something critical. Humans weren't so easily defeated. "You took my girlfriend," Jake spat, his grip tightening around the gun. "And now, I'm taking you down." Zorgoth's eyes flashed with rage, and before Jake could react, the alien's hand shot up, emitting a pulse of energy that knocked Jake back. The blast sent him crashing into the far wall. The wind knocked out of him. The world spun as he struggled to stay conscious. He was on his feet in an instant, shaking off the disorientation, his vision blurring as the pain in his ribs flared. Zorgoth was already on his feet, the alien's intimidating presence looming over him. "You should have stayed down, human," Zorgoth said coldly, raising his arm again, ready to deliver the killing blow. "But you've only delayed the inevitable." Jake's mind raced. He was outmatched. His gun wouldn't stop Zorgoth, not in the state he was in. He needed something more, something bigger, but the thought was fleeting. He couldn't let doubt take over. He had to be smarter. He had to turn the tables. Sophie's voice broke through his thoughts. "Jake, the power grid," she shouted from behind him, her voice strained but sharp. "If you disable the power, it will disable their systems." Jake's eyes snapped toward her, and for the first time, he saw the hope in her eyes, the trust that he would find a way. She was right. The Drexian ship was its own weakness. The power grid was the ship's lifeblood, and if he could overload it, he could bring down the entire ship with it. Zorgoth was distracted for just a moment, his attention diverted by Sophie's words. That was all Jake needed. With a sudden surge of energy, Jake darted toward the nearest console, his mind working in overdrive. His hands flew over the alien interface, knowing that he had mere seconds before Zorgoth realized what he was doing. The technology was foreign, but Jake was no stranger to puzzles, to complex systems. He'd spent years deciphering enemy tech, learning to adapt and improvise. This time, the stakes were far higher. The console flickered, and Jake cursed under his breath as he tried to force his way into the ship's mainframe. The alien systems fought back, locking him out at every turn. He could feel Zorgoth's presence behind him, closing in. The alien's breathing was heavy, his fury palpable. He had only one shot at this. Jake took a deep breath, focusing. He'd done this before, hacked into military systems, overridden enemy tech, but this was different. This wasn't just a matter of survival, it was about saving Sophie. He pushed past the pain in his ribs, ignoring the ache in his body, his fingers dancing over the controls with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. Suddenly, the console sparked to life, the system humming in response to his commands. He'd done it. The ship's power grid started to destabilize, the lights flickering as the systems began to shut down. Zorgoth's eyes widened in disbelief. "No," he roared, his voice a terrifying growl. "What have you done?" Jake didn't answer. Instead, he turned and bolted towards Sophie, his body moving on pure instinct. As the ship began to tremble, Jake cut through the chaos, reaching her side in an instant. The power was going down. Everything was crumbling around them. But they still had a chance. He freed her from her restraints, pulling her into his arms as the ship's systems began to fail. "We need to move," Jake shouted, his voice urgent. Sophie didn't hesitate. Together, they ran, weaving through the corridors as alarms blared, and the ship shook violently. The Drexian's control was slipping. But Zorgoth wasn't giving up. His roar echoed through the halls, a sound filled with pure rage. He would come after them. Jake knew it. But they were faster. They had to be. As they reached the exit, the ship's doors slammed shut in front of them, blocking their way. Panic surged through Jake, but Sophie's calm voice cut through the noise. "There's another way out," she said, pulling him toward a maintenance hatch hidden behind a panel. They had no time to think, only to act. The ship groaned around them as its systems began to fail. Alarms screamed in every direction, the red emergency lights casting a dim, blood-colored glow over the corridor. Jake's pulse raced, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had taken control of the situation, but Zorgoth wasn't finished yet. The alien was ruthless, and Jake could hear the pounding of heavy footsteps echoing behind them, a reminder that they weren't safe yet. "Sophie, keep up," Jake called, urging her forward as they sprinted down the darkened hall. His muscles burned from the exertion, his mind frantic but focused. They had to make it to the escape pod. There was no other option. Sophie, despite the strain of her captivity, matched his pace, her face set with determination. The fear from earlier was gone, replaced by the same fire that had kept Jake going. Together, they had a chance. They just had to get off this ship before Zorgoth tore them apart. The escape pod was just ahead, but as they turned the corner, they were met with a terrible sight. Zorgoth stood in the doorway, his towering figure blocking their path, a cruel smile curling on his lips. "You really think you can escape?" Zorgoth's voice was low and menacing, filled with the promise of death. "I've already let you run for long enough. Now, you will die." Jake's heart slammed against his ribs as he stopped dead in his tracks. They were cornered. He could hear the hum of Zorgoth's weapon charging, the dangerous energy crackling in the air. Sophie's hand found his, gripping it tightly, as though drawing strength from him. "We're not dying today," Jake said, his voice low but resolute. He didn't know how they were going to get out of this, but he wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. Zorgoth raised his hand, his glowing eyes narrowing in deadly focus. But just as he was about to fire, Jake did the only thing he could think of. He lunged, throwing himself at the alien with all his weight. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stagger Zorga for a moment, throwing off his aim. The blast of energy meant for Jake missed, slamming into the wall with a deafening crack. Sparks flew, the ship shuddering under the force of the impact. Sophie reacted without hesitation. "Go," she shouted, pushing Jake toward the escape pod. "I'll hold him off." Jake looked at her, panic rising in his chest. "No, Sophie. I'm not letting you die for me, Jake," she said, her voice hard and final. "Go." Jake hesitated for a split second, but he knew there was no time to argue. Sophie was right. If they were going to get out of this, it had to be now. With one last glance at her, he sprinted toward the pod, activating its hatch. The doors slammed shut behind him with a hiss, and within moments, the pod was hurtling into space, away from the dying Drexian ship. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as he slammed his hand against the controls. The escape pod rocketed through the atmosphere, breaking free from the crumbling Drexian craft. The ship behind them exploded in a fiery burst, the shockwave shaking their small pod. The force of the blast sent Jake tumbling backward, but the pod's shields held steady, protecting them from the chaos. "Jake," Sophie's voice, weak but relieved, came through the intercom. "You did it." Jake sat up, his hands shaking as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "We did it," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion and relief. They were free. The alien ship was destroyed. Zorgoth was left behind, and they were alive. Sophie, despite her ordeal, smiled at him through the small monitor on the wall. Her eyes were filled with gratitude, but also something else, a silent understanding between them, a promise that they would make it through this together. The storm was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. They had escaped. But they weren't out of danger yet. They were in space, surrounded by the unknown, and Zorgoth wasn't the only threat they would face. Jake's hand tightened on the pod's controls. "Let's get out of here," he muttered. "We're not done yet." The stars outside the pod's viewport were a peaceful sight, but Jake knew the real battle had just begun. They might have escaped the Drexian ship, but the war wasn't over. They had survived one fight. But there would be others. And this time, they weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for Earth. The escape pod drifted silently through the cold expanse of space, the distant stars gleaming like cold diamonds. Jake stared at the viewport, watching the streaks of light as they shot past. The ship behind them had exploded, a final, violent burst of fire and energy that left nothing but debris. Zorgoth was gone, at least for now. But Jake knew this was only a temporary victory. The Drexian Empire wasn't something you could outrun forever. "Jake," Sophie's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. Are we safe?" Jake swallowed hard, his fingers hovering over the pod's controls as he glanced at her. She was sitting behind him, strapped into one of the seats, her face still pale from the ordeal. Despite everything, her gaze was calm, focused on him. She was stronger than she gave herself credit for, stronger than anyone had any right to be after what she'd been through. "No," Jake said bluntly, turning to face her. "We're not safe. Not yet." Sophie nodded slowly, her expression serious but resolute. "What now?" Jake's mind raced. They were free from Zorgoth for the moment, but the Drexian threat still loomed large. Their ship had been destroyed, but the Drexians had fleets, and they were far from done with Earth. Jake had known this was going to be bigger than just one alien and one ship. This was a war. But that didn't change the fact that he'd made a promise. He had to get Sophie to safety. He had to protect her, and he had to prepare for the next battle. "I need to contact Earth Command," Jake said, his voice tense. "We need reinforcements. We need to figure out what the Drexians are planning and how we can stop them." Sophie leaned forward, concern crossing her face. "But how? You don't even know where we are." Jake grimaced, staring at the pod's navigation screen. We're not far from the nearest asteroid belt. If I can get a signal booster up and running, I can send a distress beacon. Earth Command should be able to triangulate our position, but that's assuming we can get the signal out. Sophie's eyes flickered to the small array of electronics around them. We don't have a lot of time, do we? Jake shook his head. No. If the Drexians find us before we make contact, we're finished. And I don't plan on going down without a fight. There was a long pause before Sophie spoke again. What about Zorgoth? What if he survived the blast? Jake felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine at the thought. Zorgoth was dangerous. If anyone could survive that kind of destruction, it would be him. The thought of the alien hunting them down again, more determined than ever, made Jake's blood run cold, but he had to push those thoughts aside for now. There was no use in worrying about the worst-case scenario. They had to focus on the present. He's not coming after us immediately, Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. The Drexians aren't stupid. They'll assess the damage first. But we can't take chances. We have to be ready for anything. Sophie nodded, her jaw set in determination. Then let's get to work. The two of them moved quickly, working together to set up the makeshift communication system. Jake guided her through the steps, his hand still a little shaky from the adrenaline of their escape. The ship's systems were foreign to them, but they managed to rig up a signal booster using some spare parts. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. As the minutes ticked by, the pod drifted farther into deep space, and the silence between them grew. It was an uneasy quiet. They both knew the stakes. The war for Earth was just beginning, and they were only a tiny part of a much larger battle. But they had each other, and that gave Jake hope. Finally, the signal booster hummed to life, and the screen blinked green. "We're online," Jake said, the relief in his voice clear. Sophie's eyes locked onto the screen, her fingers hovering over the controls, sending the distress signal now. The seconds stretched into eternity as they waited. Then, a soft beep sounded, and the message was sent. A thin thread of communication had been cast out into the vastness of space, reaching back to Earth. Jake leaned back in his seat, exhaling a long breath. They had done it. For the moment, they were safe. They had sent the message, and now, all they could do was wait. But the wait was agonizing. They were alone, isolated, drifting through the emptiness of space, and Jake knew, deep down, that this was just the calm before the storm. The Drexians were out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. They weren't done yet. The distress signal had been sent, but the silence that followed was almost unbearable. The hum of the escape pod systems was the only sound in the otherwise still interior. Outside, the stars glimmered coldly in the vastness of space, indifferent to the turmoil inside the small pod. Jake sat in the pilot's seat, staring out the viewport, his eyes distant. The tension from their harrowing escape was still thick in the air, but the worst wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "How long until Earth Command responds?" Sophie asked, her voice quiet but steady as she worked at one of the consoles beside him. The flicker of lights from the ship's dim control panel reflected in her eyes. "Depends on how fast they can triangulate our position," Jake replied, rubbing his eyes. His exhaustion was catching up to him, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving a heavy weight on his shoulders. "I don't know how long it'll take. Could be a few hours, could be days. We're out here in deep space with no way of knowing if we're even still on their radar." Sophie took a seat beside him, folding her arms across her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. She was trying to stay calm for him, but he knew the fear was still there. It was in her every move. They were alone, and in the silence of space, being alone felt heavier than ever. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice softer now. He hadn't meant to bring Sophie into all this. She wasn't trained for this, not like he was. She was supposed to be safe, back on Earth, living her life. And yet she had been dragged into this conflict because of him. Because of the Drexians. Sophie shook her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You don't have to apologize for that, Jake. We're in this together. We always have been." Jake swallowed, trying to find the right words. There were no words that could make up for the danger he had dragged her into. No words that could undo the terror she had experienced because of him. But she was right. There was no going back now. "We'll figure this out," Jake said after a long pause, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Earth Command will get our signal, and we'll make it through this. We just have to hold on." Sophie nodded, but the concern didn't leave her face. "What about Zorgoth?" she asked quietly. "If he's still alive, he'll come after us. He's not the type to let us go." Jake's mind flashed back to the alien's menacing words, the sneer in his voice when he'd threatened them. He could still feel the weight of Zorgoth's rage, the alien's unrelenting desire for revenge. "If Zorgoth survived the explosion, he'll come after us," Jake said, his jaw tightening. "But we can't worry about him right now. We've sent the signal. We've done everything we can. For now, we need to stay alert. Earth Command is our best shot." Just as Jake finished speaking, a sudden beep from the console interrupted the quiet. He shot a look at Sophie, who quickly leaned over the controls, her fingers flying across the keys. A few seconds passed before she looked up, her eyes wide with shock. "It's Earth Command," she said, voice trembling. "They've locked onto our signal." Jake's heart skipped a beat, a surge of relief washing over him. Finally, help was on the way. But the reality of what they were facing still hadn't sunk in completely. It wasn't just the Drexians. This wasn't a simple rescue. Earth was on the brink of war, and they were on the front lines. "Patch me through," Jake said, voice tight with urgency. Sophie quickly complied, and a crackling voice came through the pod's communication system. "This is Earth Command. We've received your distress signal, Captain Walker. We're aware of the situation and are currently in the process of gathering forces. We'll need you to remain in your current position until we can secure a safe route for extraction. Prepare for potential engagement." Jake nodded, though he knew they couldn't afford to sit and wait around for reinforcements. They'd be sitting ducks out here if they didn't act fast. The Drexians were relentless, and Zorgoth was still a threat. But Earth Command's response was a small light in the overwhelming darkness of space. "We're not waiting here," Jake said, a new determination settling in his bones. "If we stay in this pod, we'll be sitting targets. I'll take us to a nearby station. We'll find shelter and plan from there." Sophie's eyes met his, understanding flashing in her gaze. She didn't argue. They both knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about the future of Earth. "We'll make it," Sophie said softly, her voice filled with conviction. Jake smiled at her, the weight of the universe heavy on his shoulders, but somehow lighter with her by his side. "We'll make it." He set the course, and the pod's engines hummed to life, propelling them deeper into the unknown. The journey was far from over. The Drexians would come for them, but they had a chance now. And they were going to fight together.